Hello, Unreal Fest. Or, since we're live streaming, I can make the programming joke and say, hello, world. My name is Chris Murphy, and today we're going to be talking about 35 features in Unreal Engine 5 that you probably don't know about. Now, I'm a level with you. I originally pitched this as X features in UE5 that you don't know about, and at some point, marketing were like, we need a number. And I was like, I haven't written it yet. So you'll see how many there are. Well, if you're counting, I guess. The other thing I want to highlight before I kind of get into this is the word probably. I know there are plenty of veterans in the room. I'm still going to do my best to highlight a bunch of obscure things that are kind of in there. But, you know, there's a very good chance that some of you have picked up some of these things. That said, I'll be impressed if anyone knows all of these things. Now, for anyone there that's like, who is this guy? My name's Chris Murphy. I'm an evangelist. Historically, I handle Australia and New Zealand, and my role as evangelist, which is a weird-sounding job title for anyone unfamiliar with the tech industry, is to basically help developers within my region. Epic has a reasonably tight-knit presence in my part of the world. So consequently, we kind of head around, we help out all sorts of people, and it's a rather strange job. But in the process, there's a lot of conversations we have reasonably frequently that it's like, oh, you didn't know about this key binding? You didn't know about this feature? Oh yeah, that was a small note in a release note somewhere that you didn't read. Sorry about that. And you know, the common joke literally running through this entire conference is, you don't know about that checkbox? So in general, the alternative titles here that could have been is like features that developers groan about when they realize they exist, and things that snuck past you because you were too busy releasing a game, and why are you throwing these things at me? We have to focus on the current version. Chris, stop saying stuff. So let's go ahead and start with some of the fun stuff. Most folks know the water system that's come into Unreal. It's a fun one, but what a lot of folks aren't aware of is that we have buoyancy support in there. If you go ahead and enable the water plugin, you can go ahead and flick on a buoyancy component to your blueprints, at which point you get flotation of things, and you're probably like, cool, Chris, you floated 3 cubes, but I floated many more cubes than that. So it's a fun one. It works surprisingly well. It's one of those things that I've literally seen people engineering this system, and I'm like, we did it already. So they get angry, happy, if you know what I mean, when you find out the feature's there already. The next one here is the Niagara debugger. Plenty of VFX artists in the room, I assume. A lot of folks aren't aware of the debugger, though, which allows you to go ahead, launch it up, and freeze frame the effects. You can also go ahead and start to step through it frame by frame to see what's going on. But another really cool thing here is you can filter by system and filter variables out. So in the system viewer, I want the fireflies in the background. So I type in the word fireflies. You see that it gave me a little nice drop down as well because that effect existed. From here, I can look at that and be like, this is cool, but I really want to know why the lifetime is all screwy on these things. So I can go ahead and say, tell me the lifetime. And it's going to go ahead and do that for me. So I wanted to flag that this was there because folks aren't always aware of it. The other really cool feature on this is that you can go ahead and manipulate the speed as well. So if you want to run an effect in slow motion to just see what's going on, feel free to launch this up and change the speed as you go on. It's good. So the next one is custom decal response. Now, generally when you project a decal, I've gone ahead and I've projected a gradient decal onto this, which is on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you can see we have cool blending going on with that decal. Okay, so what's actually happening there that's really cool is that Unreal Engine 5 has the ability to let you custom set up the decal response of a surface. So inside the material, you can actually say, hey, when a decal is projected onto you, this is how I want to do it. In this case, I'm just doing a height blend with the grime to make it look a little bit like it's blended into some certain areas of it first. Now, this is really useful. The 2 main functions you need to care about if you're using materials here are your debuffer texture and your apply debuffer nodes. The other thing that's really important here is receives decals has to be false. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, but what receives decals equals false does in this scenario is it basically says, stop receiving decals in the traditional way. And if I need decals, I'll handle them in the material itself myself. Okay, if you're wondering what the material was as to what I just did, I love how many hands I just saw go, whoa! Then this is a quick thing. I'm literally just getting the same material, doing a standard blend, and then just throwing in an alpha with a height lobe. It's nothing too complicated. Placeable clouds are fun. This is a system that a lot of folks are unaware of. I bring this up because this is a cool little system that's sitting inside the Volumetrics plugin. You can access it, you can tear it apart because it's written in Blueprint, so you can extend this as you see fit. You really only need 2 actors within it. There's a cloud mask, and then there's the cloud mask generator. Once you kind of pop them in, it actually handles a generation, pushes out a render target. The render target then filters into your cloud setup. Now, the default cloud material won't work, so you'll need to enable the Volumetrics plugin, and then inside of that, I suggest you take a look at UE5, and that shows you where the render target is meant to go in a standard cloud pipeline. This isn't exactly like a, hey, it's an out-of-the-box feature, but it is a really, really good feature to drop in, test with, and experiment, because so much of your view in any open world game is literally the sky, and a lot of developers are like, so I put in the default clouds, and they looked great, and then they go about their day, and it never changes. So I wanted to highlight this for a little bit more customization. Custom prim data came in a little while ago, but a lot of folks are unaware of it. And I think it was for 5.0 that we cleaned up the interface. So historically speaking, when you have a parameter, in this situation, you can see that we have one parameter, and when I change it, a bunch of rocks in the scene all change together. And that makes me sad, because sometimes you want to go ahead and you want to have it so that each rock could be modified independently. Now, a lot of people would be like, guess I better make a blueprint, and I'll be like, guess you're wrong, because we have a great system that you can use called custom prim data that pushes the variable off to the primitive. You can see here that I can now add moss intensity, and only that one asset is changing, all right? So it's actually throwing these variables on the primitive and then pushing it up. It's a really nice thing. You can do more than just scalars. You can have vectors. You need to custom assign what numbers these are being assigned to, like it's custom prim 0, custom prim 1, or whatever. So there's a little bit more work in it, and you need to kind of think it through from a pipeline perspective if you're incorporating it. But it is really, really useful, and it looks good. Now, a couple of things that are really useful here that are worth mentioning is that if you historically get a material that is like identical, but then you change a value, those things no longer batch, right? Because you've got one instance with the value of like, let's say you've got a damage lerp in there that's like a damage of 50%, and then another one that has a damage of 25%. They're technically different materials. When it's on the custom prim data, it's loading it, they have the same material, it's kind of just loading that variable from the primitive instead, at which point we have batching, which is great. So it's good for artistic vision, and it's good for performance reasons. Everybody wins, but it's a really like nerdy sounding art feature. And I think that's how it got missed by some. This is something that's in 5.1, but you know when you look at like the release notes and you're like, no one is gonna notice this. So I'm just being preemptive about this one and flagging it. This is a 5.1 feature, which is really cool, which literally lets you go ahead and create variables and functions, and it generates the C++ header information over here for you to use as necessary. This is really good when you're learning it, because you no longer have to like, I mean, I'm sure anyone here that's done any programming here has gone through the ropes. You know, when you're first learning U properties and such, you're like, what's it look like? This is kind of a nice, friendly way to do that. Another reason I like it is because it's a friendly way to kind of put your toe in the water as a blueprinter that's moving into programming that may want to have some, maybe all you want to do is make something inside the asset registry, so you need to declare it. More on that later. This is a cool one. Interpolate material instance parameters. So see this node over here? It takes 2 material references that have a common parent material, important, and then it takes the current target. And what it does in this scenario, you'll see that I have material version A, material version B. Once again, there's the node, and I've bound it to spacebar. And when I hit play, you can see that it's interpolating between those two. Now, the great thing there means that your artist can basically make a version of the material that is like, here's what it looks like with the shield effect applied, or here's what it looks like when they take damage. And you can kind of have it as more of an artist-driven version instead of them just changing a whole bunch of those values in the blueprint. You know when someone tells you a console command and you're like, how on earth was I meant to know that? Well, a lot of folks don't know. If you click help, you can click console variables, which generates a searchable document of all of our console. Now, I strongly recommend you check that button there that says search help as well, because that checks our tooltips, which is really, really good information. But in doing so, I can just be like, look, I have a problem with fog right now. Tell me everything that could fix it. And then the engine's like, here's your list. And then we high five, and everyone's happy. Speaking of console variables, I wanted to bring up the console variables plugin, which is off by default, but if you turn it on, it's cool. It lets you add variables, which is great, but you can then flick them on and off, and you can see where the variables were flicked on or off. You can revert them to like the constructor, so you can see what that default state of them was. Another really, really cool feature is that you can go through and you can save those variables into presets. So if you have a common setup that you need to have when you're testing various things, like these 5 options are off, it's really cool to just be like, do that, computer. And again, high fives all around, feature implemented. A/B test, this is not ab test. A/B test is a great little console command that if you type A/B test before a console command and then enter the 2 values that you want to test, Unreal will automatically flip between those 2 values over and over and over again, and it actually tells you the performance difference of those 2 things, and then it tells you the chance that that was from noise. Okay? Type in A/B test stop or you're gonna have a bad time. But this is, by the way, I used the worst possible image to show the fog off on this in hindsight, so sorry about that very mild flickering in the distance, but hopefully you got the point. This is the actual worst image in this for a cool feature, but the Common UI plugin was added in 4.2.7. It's a feature of Common UI widgets that get used in many, many games. I mean, there are a lot of features that I'm sure anyone here in the room that's handled UMG, that you've built that framework again and again between projects where you're like, I guess we need to have a rotunda in this project again. Common UI gives you a lot of those basics, but another really cool aspect of Common UI is it allows you to give style assets to your buttons and widgets, so it's much easier for you to change things in large sweeping moves rather than having to like go through them all one by one. So being able to like pass it in as an object is really good. It's also a bit nicer for interactivity with gamepads. Reload asset is one that I see happen frequently. You can see here that I'm changing a Niagara asset. So instead of going, oh no, I broke it, you can just go asset reload, and this will grab the version of it on disk. You don't need to restart the editor. And you know, it works there, so you can see that it's reverted it, but it actually works for levels as well. So again, like in this case, I'm duplicating a bunch of stuff, and then I'm like, oh no, I broke it. Don't restart the editor. Just go to it and click reload, and then it should revert back to what you had. Okay? I like that there's a little bit of groaning in the room on that one. Like, I felt collective pain. This is a fun one. This is in UE5. This is the waveform collapse generation plugin. So if you build a sample environment like this, it kind of shows you how bits of a thing can be stuck together. And you can use this widget. This is a plugin you can enable. You can use that widget to create like sample data, and then you can go ahead and generate samples based on the thing that you've built. Okay? I bring this up because this is like one of the most frequently rebuilt things that I see when people are first learning procedural generation, and like they jump on Twitter and they post it and they're really happy because it sounds really technical, waveform collapse generator, right? But it's a really nice one to have just a reference point for how something like that could go together. So I wanted to flag that this existed, and if you ever want to kind of, you know, go down that path, that there is something that you can have as a reference point. Okay? So it is all just housed within this editor utility widget that has the output and input controls from it. RVTs, or runtime virtual textures, these are really, really lovely. They've been in there for a while. Some of you that follow me on Twitter probably consider me a runtime virtual texture evangelist, and I totally understand why. But the RVTs basically create a large sample of the world. Can we bring the house slides down for this sample, if that's okay? I'm not sure if you have the controls there. Sorry to put you on the spot. He's shaking his head no. But if you look really carefully, here, you can see that it's actually blending into the environment. So as this asset's kind of going into it, it's actually doing a smooth blend, and that controls the normals as well. This means that your rocks don't look like they've just got like a hard polyline and stuff stuck into the environment. It's a really, really good technique. My apologies for using dark colors on dark colors for the example in a well-lit room. But essentially what it does is it takes an orthographic image from, like, so it just sees the XY, and then it passes that off, and you can then sample that data. So your landscapes can output that information. It's also really good for performance reasons, because you can kind of get the cache that's coming through there and pipe that back into the landscapes. Check out our docs for more info on this, but it is a really, really good feature, both artistically and for performance reasons if you have outdoor environments that you want to feel good. Now, Niagara Fluids are a feature that plenty of folks have seen bits and pieces of, but just to flag it, it is a plugin that if you enable, you can go ahead and create your own. Now, I wanted to kind of step into what that looks like, because if you enable the plugin and create one with the simple particle source emitter, it's actually a really comparatively friendly way to get into it. And what it does is it actually passes its information from that left emitter into the right emitter to control the fluids. So on the right-hand side, you can see we're able to change the temperature, we're able to change the advection, we're able to change all of the stuff that happens after the flames kind of get created. But on the left-hand side, that emitter is actually spawning particles that it's pushing out, that it's pushing out. And what's actually happening is that means that you can control the visuals of these effects, right? So in this case, I can go ahead and say, hey, spawn them inside of a torus and create this cool ring of fire. And I can control this in different ways. But it actually is just being controlled by a standard, rather boring emitter that just happens to have a nice way to pass this information to the complicated stuff. And I bring that up because a lot of people open them up and they're like, that looks too complicated. But quite often, I'm like, if you only go to the emitter summary on the right, there's a good chance that you can tweak it and create some pretty cool effects that you may not be aware of. Now, here's an awkward one. If you've got something with fluids and you add an actor tag collider to a mesh, I know, what that does is fluids will now collide with those specific surfaces. Okay? So you can see here that flames are actually spraying into that mesh, and if I move it around, the flames go past. So again, you're adding the actor tag collider, and that will enable collisions for fluids, okay? Which, again, it just looks really cool. So I'm just very happy looking at that still. So again, just here, collider. Okay, so I know I'm reiterating this point, but it's missed by many. Now, another thing that's really useful for any folks that are developing content is the advanced search syntax. So in this situation, I'm typing nanite enabled is equal to false, and the triangle count is greater than whatever number I type in. And what that actually will do is that will show me every single thing within the content browser that has those values. Now, it's worth noting that this metadata that you see here, this information, that is what is being saved in the asset registry, and that's what it's searching. So anything that's really appearing in there with a number is something you can then query through the browser. Now, that information is referred to as the asset registry, okay? So whenever you define a property in C++, if you flag it as asset registry searchable, okay, that will now be added into that information. So a cool thing is that if you did say, let's say you have weapon blueprints in your game, right? And you create a bunch of different weapons that have a damage value, and you make the damage value asset registry searchable. In your content browser, you can now say, get me all weapons that have a damage of greater than 300 and things like that, okay? So that information being used for your own nefarious purposes, good stuff. And if we go through here, the other awkward thing that folks don't know about is the columns view. I know this seems weird, but everyone often keeps the content browser and just default tiles. But if you use the columns view, again, it's searching all of that information, and you can now arrange by certain things without having to type in queries. So I wanted to flag it because, again, it's a thing that a lot of people miss, and I wanted to make sure you're aware of it. Blend space graphs are a feature that has appeared with UE5, and that is if you create a blend space asset, you may be familiar with this, but what you may not be familiar with is that if you double-click on any of those, you actually now have subgraphs. So you can now have some really crazy nested behavior with more complicated stuff handled within each blend, which I personally think is really, really good. But be careful doing it because you can get some really deep, complicated behavior pretty quick. But again, a lot of folks don't realize it because there was a lot of changes with UE5, right? Bake to control rig. So in this case, we have a regular animation, but it's worth noting that if you go edit in sequencer, bake to control rig, and you have a setup on a control rig that will support it, then what this will actually do is grab that animation that's come in from an external program, and I'm actually bake it out as keyframes within sequencer for all of the controls, not just the bones, but the controls. Now, the great part of this is you're now able to kind of tinker with it and tweak it as you see fit. I bring this up because you're probably looking at that thing down there and you're like, Chris, that's a lot of keyframes. And there is a simplify keyframe button when you create it. But if in post you want to do a little bit more than that, be aware that you can go to the curve editor. You can grab whatever keyframes that you want to tweak. In this case, I guess all of them. And you can go through and you can click filter. And filter, I can go simplify. And that will now remove a whole bunch of keyframes and give me some generally slightly nicer curves that I can now use. Now, the great thing about all of this is that when you do that, it creates an animation in Unreal that saves out as an animation for that mesh. So this means that if you have something like this, Like, how many times have you been given an animation from someone and then you've been putting together a prototype and that animation is slightly wrong, but they've gone home for the night, but you really want that feature working. So it's really nice to be able to kind of grab that. Sorry, that sounds like it's coming from a personal place. But like, you really want that feature working, right? And it's really nice to be able to kind of jump in there and tweak it and clean it up and whatever else. And they might do their proper job later if they feel like it. But it's really great to be able to bring these things in and tweak with it. It's also great because you can grab, if your team is moving to control rig, knowing that you can use previous assets that you've created, previous animations, and potentially bring them across is really good. So animation mirroring is another one that popped up with UE5, which allows you to set up a mirror table and then play your things on the left or the right. Again, this is really useful because if we have something like, let's just say you wanted to add left-handedness and all of them are right-handed by default, or let's say you have some cool sprint animations and a leap that always comes off of one foot, it's really nice to know that you have options there. While we're on the animation subject, because I guess I'm on that train now, you know how often you save variables out in an event graph for animation blueprints? Be aware that you can create an arbitrary function, and inside that function, if you make the return value, which is what I'm doing here, called return value, and you make this function do whatever you need to, in this case it's accessing third-person characters, and I'm making it const, there I go, making it const. This function, and I know that was a couple of steps, but this function is now something that we can query inside of the animation. So back in this animation here, I'm now able to go grab this pin and say, I want you to run the get third-person character function, and then I'm able to go down and get the movement component, and I can just check if isFalling is happening without having to create, like, raise your hand if you've created an animation blueprint before. All right, now keep your hand up if you had to add like 50 variables at the start of that you were kind of regretting the whole time. Yeah, notice not a single hand went down. So it's nice having some functionality like this, which just kind of cleans up some of that stuff. CubeGrid is honestly one of my favorite things that was added in 5. It's a bit of a strange one. It's a modeling tool, but if you go down to the tool that is labeled as CubeGrid, then you can go ahead and do this. It's really nice. You can just use Control-Click to kind of extrude sections, create corners, pull things out, et cetera, et cetera. And when you click the complete button that's awkwardly occluded in this GIF, it will then go ahead and save it out so that Lumen will kick in. So you can see that I did that, and we've now got a nice little asset. This is really, really great for prototyping. Again, I see a lot of people kind of weirdly scaling different cubes and stuff within their environment sometimes, where CubeGrid would just be much nicer for simple, effective blockouts of things. Fixed pivot tool is another one. Like, how frequently you've been given a model and the pivot's in the wrong spot. You can just click on the model, then go to the pivot tool, and just be like, put this in the bottom center. The thing that we all want. And it'll do it. Pivot. Done. Geometry script is a fun one. In this situation, I did something rather simple. Geometry script here is just running a simple Boolean so that I can stick a fan on objects, and it will automatically create a version of that object with a hole in it. And what I'm doing is I've created a cylinder, and we're just Booleaning that cylinder against whatever object I'm sticking it on. But I want to point out that that was really only just a couple of nodes. That was really quite quick to put together. So just be aware that this functionality exists, it's really effective, and you can create some interesting tools. I wanted to flag this because people have seen this in Lyra, and they've been like, that's a Lyra thing. And I just want to be like, it's an everyone thing, and it's surprisingly easy. So if you feel like you have some easy, low-hanging fruit for potential GeoScript stuff, please, by all means, get on it. Now, the next one I want to touch on is texture baking, because again, texture baking is one of those things that people are like, yes, I need to do that in an external package. But it is worth noting that you can bake out curvature, normals, bent normals, and more, which I put in bold, in Engine. And all you need to do is go to the modeling tools and go to the baking. Now, a really, 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 probably too many reallys, but cool aspect of that is that you can bake this stuff to textures, but you can also bake it to vertex data. So if you want to bake out the curvature to, say, the red channel of all of your meshes, you can now access curvature in any of your materials, right? And the reason that's really good is if you look at your average nanite mesh, well, not average, but let's grab a nanite mesh as an example. They have really dense verts, right? And quite frequently, we're pulling in textures that are quite large. So if you're looking at nanite meshes and you're like, I love that fidelity, but I don't necessarily want to have really bespoke, baked out textures for all of these things. You can do things like access the curvature to do some kind of organic blends to maybe automatically bring rust and stuff like that into these meshes and share texture sets between some of those meshes, which means you kind of get a best of both worlds situation where you end up with a really high fidelity mesh, but you also end up with your texture reuse staying pretty much in check, and overall quite often a pretty good size for the overall asset set that's being used. Which is really good. So yeah, vertex colors. My one thing that I want to flag there is please try and keep that pipeline in mind from an early point in production if you can, just so that you know ahead of time that red channels, green channels, and blue channels are all going to be allocated to specific kinds of things. Otherwise you can kind of end up in a messy thing pretty quickly because the artists are doing their thing and other artists are doing another thing. So if you ever look at an effect and you're like, that's too expensive, I can't use that on mobile, just be aware that Niagara has a baker built into it. You can actually generate flipbooks from Niagara, which is a really useful feature. And this is good as well for things like if you maybe it's just a distant LOD, right? Maybe it's not even for low-end platforms. Maybe you just in the distance want to have an explosion. But in this situation, yeah, I just baked it out as a rather simple flipbook, and it's there. It's one of those things that's like weirdly invisible until someone points it out, and you're like, there is a button that says Baker that's been in front of me this whole time. So I can see a bunch of you are like, huh. So just be aware of that one. This is another great one because this is what you expect particles to do in Sequencer, and they don't by default, right? Like, when you play an effect in Sequencer and it's triggering an event, that really surprised him. So what happens is it's playing the effects normally, but if you go ahead and add a life cycle track down the bottom, and then you go to the properties and you set this section down here to say age update is desired age, Sequencer will now control the point of time that that effect is at. And if the effect has been set up for determinism, it's going to go ahead and it'll scrub forward and scrub back, which is just really, really great when you're doing any like animation work or cutscenes or anything like that, and you really want to know that everything is exactly where it should be. Okay. This is a cool one. You have to enable this, but if you enable the Chaos Cache Manager, you can go ahead and record with that button down the bottom. You can record chaos things that have occurred, so explosions and things that have collapsed, and you can play them forward, but you can also then go ahead and do some fun stuff because you can play them backwards, right? So in this case, we're like unexploding the barrels, but if you create something like this in the scene, I could maybe make an effect that makes it look like a wizard did it and unexplode a bridge that's fallen down or some rafters that have collapsed or whatever else it may be, So I just wanted people to be aware that like the Chaos Cache Manager is pretty cool. People kind of think of it as like, well, why would I want to blow it up when I can just custom blow it up? And sometimes like really tailoring what that effect looks like is fun. This is a good one and the only audio slide that I have going on here. But if you get two effects, I have music and wind playing at the same time. And you type in this command followed by a word. It will only play sounds with that word in it. I typed in wind, everything else stopped. I type in music, the wind has stopped. Okay, and if you type in the command again and hit enter, everything plays again, all right? Because again, like, if you're trying to debug footsteps or something like that, it's really nice to just be like, please, engine, give me only footsteps. Okay. The next one I wanted to cover here is Placeable Volumetric Fog. This is something I really, really love. But again, it's one of those things that folks are aware of volumetric fog in the engine, but they're often not aware of the placeable variety. And what happens is if you create a material in the fog domain, you can go ahead and you can drop a sphere inside the world. And when you do, you can apply that material to it. Excuse me. And when you do, you can now see that we have volumetric fog that's placeable in very specific locations. And you can go ahead and add panning to it, and you can move it around and do whatever you need to. But like, see how that lets us like really kind of customize the mood in that room? It's a good feeling. There's a couple of like caveats to it. But before I get into them, actually, one other thing I wanted to show you is that, again, these effects can be set up from movement. So if you look at this one, you can see it a little bit better. I think I did more on this slide. We'll give it just a moment. So see how that fog is kind of gently moving? I swear I made this bigger. Okay, yeah, it's a bit easier to see there now that there's darkness in the background. But see, you kind of get that gentle wisps going up. You know, it brings a lot of life to the scene, and it's pretty easy to do. Couple of things, just make sure that you've made your material in the volume domain, and you've gone ahead and you've enabled exponential height fog, but you've turned volumetric fog on in your exponential height fog actor. A thing that is a bit of a gotcha is you still need to have a value greater than 0 in your exponential height fog. It can't be turned off and then only have volumetric fog in the scene. You need to have a value that is greater than 0, even if it is 0.001. Just make sure that's set up. And for anyone here that's like, yeah, but how'd you do it? This is the material graph that I used to create that effect that you just saw. I just made sure that it was additive and in the volume domain. And in this case, I'm using a volume texture to kind of create some of the noise around the edges. If you want to see more on this specific thing, you can check out my Unreal Engine 5 guided tour video that's sitting on the developer community online. And we have a node graph that you can just copy paste straight into your thing. The next one I want to touch on was named reroutes. In the material editor, you can right-click on reroute nodes and say create a named reroute, and it will do this, and you can tinker with them and change them around, and you can add new ones. But a cool thing that a lot of folks are unaware of exists now is if you feel like, no, I hate named reroutes now, you can right-click on them, and you can collapse them back to a reroute, okay? So if sometimes you're actually just doing it for while you're working on something, or maybe you want it to permanently look like that, but I want people to just be aware of that. Now, that's 35, but again, I kind of just kept going. So since we have time, by the way, if anyone's wondering why I haven't tweeted like any tips and tricks for the last 2 months, it's because I've basically been like, I'll put it in the presentation. So that's why. But since we still have time, let's go ahead and hit up some other things that are worth flagging. Common Conversation is an experimental framework that sits inside of UE5. It's snuck in there. It's worth checking out because it's an experimental framework for building conversation trees. Again, it's really cool to kind of have this set up. It's the fundamentals for things such as, fundamentals of these things. So it's your graph setup. You can add tasks, side effects, and conditions to each of these things. There's some support for networking and replication. I'll level with you. I haven't had a chance to really attack this yet. It's more of I opened it up, saw that it was there, started tinkering with it, asked an engineer who was like, yeah, it's there. And then kind of, you know, that hanging silence afterwards. So again, for something like this, it's experimental. However, even if it's experimental, one of the wonderful things about UE5 is you can open our source code. So even if you're looking at writing your own, it's still really lovely to look at something that Epic's done. And even if you're like, I'm not sure if that's still going to be there or what's going on, the thing that I always stress here is it's really great to copy someone else's homework. You know, so if you can go ahead and look at that thing and be like, okay, it'll make your life easier building your own that may have your own conditions. Niagara G-buffer access is another thing that a lot of folks missed out on, but I really love. So in Niagara, you can sample the G-buffer, and a cool thing of that is you can say to Niagara, hey, what color is the pixel behind the particle that I'm about to spawn? And it'll be like, it's red, and there's this much roughness. And then you can go ahead and sample that information and throw that onto a particle. So it's actually really easy to create some pretty like crazy Niagara effects where you like sample the entire view of the world, throw particles on them, and then dissolve everything into it. You know, you can create some really cool like screen space effects that are sampling the world, and I don't know. I love it, but I haven't found a cool enough demo yet for me to be like, this is the exact use case. But I have used it before on some things like dirt and grime. So whenever I had dirt, kind of like dust coming off of the ceiling, I sampled the original color of the area that the particle was spawning. And instead of blending just the transparency out, I actually blended the color out as well into the dust effect that I eventually wanted to kind of create some slightly better visuals on that front. Another thing you can do there is, again, if you want dust blowing across the ground, just sample that initial thing and you can kind of create something a bit more finer grain that feels like it belongs. Sequencer player camera blends. This is something that a lot of folks miss, and it's really fair. I understand why. The thing that everyone misses is top corner of this. So In this scene, I've put a trigger in there, and I've got a sequence with a camera. Now, the camera's moving around, right? And I've go to the director track, and I'm setting this up to can blend. And if you grab that very right-hand corner and very left-hand corner, you can actually extend it to create this blend track. Do you see that? Now, if you have no previous camera, you know what this does? It blends from the player camera into the cinematic, and then it blends out of the cinematic back into the player camera. There's a person over here that was just like at the person next to them, so I can only assume that one of you built it for the other one. My apologies. So, like I said, it's kind of, it's a little bit tucked away because you have to really grab that top right corner. Like, see this little white pixel? Now, see this triangle in the top corner? You've just got to grab that and pull it out, okay? But yeah, blending in and blending out means you can create some really cool effects, you know? Like, if you want to have it like as the player steps through a doorway, and even if it's a first-person game, you can do some fun here. Because like, as the player steps through a doorway, you can suddenly just seize control of their camera, do some cool-looking cinematics, like they're getting attacked by someone and pushed out a window or whatever. And then as they land again, you've already moved the player over to that, and you kind of blend the camera back in again. And you can have some nice kind of like seamless effects if you're really quick and careful with it. But again, like I've seen quite a few developers build this feature, and like when I tell them that it's like right click and then move the thing, they're like, no one saw that triangle. And I'm like, sorry. So I want to flag this one. It's pre-skinned local position, bounds, and normal. And I've got a vertex interpolator node in there, which you will need to do it. What happens is this. The screen doesn't really do this justice, so you're going to have to look at my hand gestures as I explain this one. But generally what happens is when you have a projection in world space, so you're doing a world-aligned texture, what happens is that texture it looks like it's projected from a projector. And as you move, the stuff moves with you. Everyone still with me? Now, you can do some really simple transform math to, you know, keep projecting in the actor's space. But the problem is if I want to dissolve a person, weird sentence outside of a game dev conference, but if I want to dissolve a person and they're moving their arms, you don't want to someone's arms get in the way. But if I'm dissolving a person, right, VFX-wise, and they're moving their arms, that creates a real problem for me. This is getting worse. So what happens is as they're moving, the coordinates are going to be moving around as well, you know, and you're going to get that weird jump back. Now, what's really cool is what these nodes do, the pre-skin local position, bounds, and normals, is it grabs that information as if they were in their T-pose, okay? And because it grabs it in their T-pose, when you're dissolving them, the sphere mask that you use to dissolve them, or in this case, I'm just applying camouflage, so really, really bright camouflage, but in this case, I'm applying like noise to them. But notice as they move around, that noise isn't shifting either. Do you see that? So that's because I'm grabbing that information from like basically their T-pose state, projecting it over there, and then I'm carrying that through. So again, this is really, really good for effects. And a common thing that I see in video games is, you know, the person gets destroyed or disintegrated or whatever, and then as they collapse, I watch their foot disintegrate and then undisintegrate for a second, and I'm like, you. All of a sudden, I find myself on Twitter being like, hey, use this. So just be aware that that's there, and everyone's happier for it. Screen space transforms, just be aware that if you grab the center of the dot, it's in screen space. I know that's silly, but okay, again, a lot of folks aren't aware of it. Cool thing you can do in Unreal that's off by default is in the viewport look and feel section, you can enable rotational screen space. So that kind of gives you this circular thing around the widget, and now wherever you are, you can just rotate relative to your camera, okay? It's nice, it's there, it's easy to work with. Statistics viewer, this is a little bit different when it comes to having nanite meshes in your scene, but it is still an early thing to flag. Is just if you look at your scene and you want to quickly just get some information about what's there, just be aware that you can use the statistics view to really quickly just be like, oh, okay, there are some really high textures being used in this scene, and I was not aware of that. It happens pretty frequently, and it's a very easy first port of call when you're trying to like check out your texture memory and things like that. So I wanted to flag it. Now, obviously the next port of call is generally GPU capture stuff, you know, when you start doing things like profile GPU. Now, this is an awkward one, but how it works is this. There's a series of commands you can do that allows you to capture GPU information that shows you on a per material level, but it used to be this it's like 5 commands that you're setting up to disable RHI thread and such, and it's a bit of a pain. But we actually set up a thing which is if you type in r.rhi set GPU capture options space 1 and then do your capture, this will now give you a per material cost as you scroll through. Now, I made the mistake of capturing this on a machine with a 3090 in it, so everything's it's pretty much 0.0. But you can still see some of these values are non-zero. So that's just kind of a useful little tip to know about, that if you type in that specific command, you can get it. So again, I thought this was going to repeat, so I'm going to just do that. So the command for any folks that wanted it is here, which is r.rhi set GPU capture options. Okay? It's a useful little one. Just make sure that when you're done with your profiling, you've set it back to 0. Okay? Gives you a bit more information. Procedural foliage is a little tucked away because it's in the editor options, not in a plugin. So you need to enable this on your editor. But how it works is you can get your procedural foliage volume by just dropping that into the world, expanding it to the size you want, and creating a foliage spawner, which really just says what foliage do you want. You can set up rules and guidelines that say how much foliage should be put into the world and whether things can grow in the shade, how many seeds they distribute, what the average distance of the seed distribution is, and what their collision is like. And a cool thing is that when you bake this out and you click that simulate button, what it goes ahead and does is it creates it as regular foliage. And the advantage of that is you can now erase stuff and add stuff without, it just kind of does the boring stuff at the start. And the other thing that's really cool is if you get those variables right, often they look better than what I painted in the first place. And the reason for that is because they're spreading by, hey, this one spread these seeds, which created these ones, and whatever else. You end up with really nice, natural-looking patches, which I really love. And yeah, it's a really just good starting point that saves you a ton of time. So just be aware that it exists. And when you are done with it, you can just get rid of the procedural foliage stuff and just treat it like regular foliage, which I think is great. Camera locked movement. Some folks are unaware of this one. Just if you hold down shift while dragging, the camera sticks to it. Again, I know this has been in Unreal for a long time, but too frequently I do that, or I watch someone do that classic drag, move the camera, drag, move the camera, and then while I'm sitting behind them, I'm like, do I tell them? Because of that, it's a good idea to just be aware of it. Another one that I use pretty frequently is environmental bookmarks. So if I hit 1 at that starting position, Control 1 and then Control 2, I can then use 1 and 2 to just flip between those 2 positions. I can do the same thing over here with Control 3, and now I have 1, 2, and 3. And I can really easily just toggle between all of those positions that are in the environment. Okay, now one thing I want to flag with this is that one of the first things I do whenever someone's makes the mistake of letting me open their level is I actually just kind of hit 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 0, because that actually generally shows me what was important to that artist when they were making the scene, because they've kind of created these little this is the control room, and this is a tower, and this is whatever I've got. And it's actually a really nice way to kind of quickly blitz between them. And every now and then you'll discover that all of the bookmarks are in weird spots, and you're like, someone else did something, and you've built over the top of it. And they're like, yeah. I'm like, how'd you know? And you're like, well, I'm teleporting inside of your mountain, and et cetera, et cetera. So just be aware of that one. So it's Control. Sorry, I should have had some stuff on screen. Next one's nice. This is the shadow pass switch. So let's say I'm putting a light inside of this branded light globe, which are not official swag. You can use a node called the shadow pass switch. And what it does is it says, hey, when I'm rendering the shadow, this is what I want you to do, but when I'm rendering you, this is what I want you to do. And now you can see we're still getting the shadow on the bottom of that light globe, but notice that we're no longer casting that you shadow that we see here, or unwanted shadow, if you will. And it is really just one node. This is really, really good as well on, if you ever do an effect where you have a camera that's moving through a wall or dithering out like a gate or something like that. You have a chase camera and you're dithering stuff out as your camera moves through it. You know what I'm talking about here? Yeah. So shadow pass is really good for you to be like, look, I want the view to dither, but I want the camera the shadows to always stay as if the dithering never occurred. Because again, another thing that you see quite often on people that have got the dithering for the camera is all of a sudden they get some weird shadow action happening because they're disappearing too. So just wanted to flag it with everyone. Move component to node. I like this because it's a really simple little async blueprint function. So I'm doing an attach, and then that was way too quick, but hopefully that, yeah, I put a slow motion on it. So what actually happens here is, as in this situation, it's saying move the component over the course of 0.5 seconds to 0, 0, 0. And because I've attached it, it's just moving up to her hand because I had attached it to her hand. It's a really, really simple little node. But I'll tell you what, if you're making a VR experience, I personally really love this because it's just when you pick something up in VR, instead of it just like popping into their hand, that like quarter second, half a second of it going, that was louder than expected, into your hand is a really good, like it just feels better. It feels like what you expected it to do instead of like, bam, you have weapons now. So move component 2 is a useful little one. I love it in prototyping. Yeah. So simulation stages are a feature within Niagara that a lot of folks are unaware of. I wanted to flag this with people because essentially what it lets you do is iterate over different data inside of Niagara. So instead of just running your spawn and your tick, you can go ahead and you can say, hey, I want to go ahead and iterate over every particle and do this to them. Or I want to iterate over every section of a render target to do something based on all of that information. Now, another really cool thing about this is that Niagara, and this is especially true, this is something you do through simulation stages, is that Niagara doesn't need to output particles. And what's really great about that is you can run a Niagara system that's actually outputting to a render target through sim stages, because you iterate through all of the bits of a render target, and you're like, you know, you get a pixel, you get a pixel, and set it up to whatever you want to do. Now, what's really great about that is it means that if you're kind of tinkering around, this is something I threw together in about 15 minutes, and what it actually is I just literally fed a Niagara render target, which you can see in the bottom corner there. So it's just generating that, and I'm just feeding that render target into the cloud system. Okay, so it's a really, really quick thing to do because the cloud system already exists, right? Like we have that. That is a thing. And when I'm kind of grabbing that cloud information, and instead of just using a regular texture, I'm just kind of piping the render target that we're getting into there. If you want to do this yourself, by the way, just look at the content examples project that we have and check out the advanced Niagara room. And there is a nice advecting Niagara setup, which is a really good example for you to just kind of hit with a hammer and do your own thing to. But I want folks to be aware of it because, again, it's just, there's some really advanced effects like, I've seen similar effects like this getting a gross number of retweets on Twitter, and every time I'll be like, it's just a sim stage. And I want everyone to know that they can do it too. It's accessible. So fun times. There we go. This is the simple, like, my boss is coming mode. Hit Shift F11 and it will hide your taskbar. I just flagging with the world, because quite often when I'm saving videos out or saving GIFs, I find it really useful to just go ahead and say, hey, for this information, I want to, I just don't want the taskbar down there. There's no purpose to that being around. Next up, I have collapsing and expanding blueprint material nodes. Don't do this instead of functions, but it is nice to have for certain situations where it's like one-time use. So I collapsed all those nodes to a subgraph, but I want to flag that you can then right-click and you can expand them back to where they were. So if you do have blueprint logic that's really just a one-time thing, sometimes it's nicer to just kind of get that and say, I want you to just be one single node. And finally, we have press K to keep location after physics. So all of these kayaks have physics on them, right? And if I select all of those kayaks and I press K on them, K for keep, what it will actually do when I stop simulating is keep them all where they were. Okay? So if you want to make a reasonably organic-looking mess, this is a really good way to go about it. And just make sure you turn off simulate physics when you're done, otherwise they're going to keep simulating. Okay? So with that, that brings me to the end. We have 30 seconds left, so nailed it. Thank you very much for coming. I hope this has been useful, and I hope to see you around the rest of Unreal Fest.